Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this short video, we will actually be looking at how to answer questions for accounting professional exams which are related to internal controls. So this is a very common question. Questions on internal controls are actually very common questions in your auditing exam, business assurance, whether it be HKICPA, CP Australia, or ACCA, or a matter of fact, for any professional accounting exams, you will see a question on internal control. And if your exam format is essay based or case study based like HKICPA has or ACCA has, then you will pretty much see this question either in a long case study or a short case study. Usually it will be a short case study because the question itself cannot be very long if you understand the topic in detail, if you understand what kind of questions can come from this topic. So let's get started. In this short video, I plan to discuss or to give you a guide on how to actually solve for questions which are related to internal control, per se internal control deficiency, right? So let's get started with this one. The first step would be to read the question carefully, right? Now, what we mean by reading question carefully, because when we are in the exam or when you are doing an exam, uh, your nerves will always get the best out of you. So don't get nervous. The main thing there would be to understand the question very carefully. Reread the question if you have to. I would suggest at least read two to three times and make sure that you understand the question very clearly. Once you have understood the question, you should actually also pinpoint the scope of the problem, right? So which will tell you if you have understood the question very well or not, right? Once you have understood the question, we can move on to the next step, which is to identify the internal control deficiency, right? So since I'm talking about internal control, per se internal control deficiency, the case study that you are looking at will have an internal control deficiency or deficiencies actually. So depending on the number of marks that they allocate, you can actually tell whether it's going to have a deficiency or deficiencies. Usually it will be deficiencies in order to actually give you some room so that you can spot some internal control deficiencies, right? So internal control deficiencies could be related to segregation of duties. They could be related to inadequate review and approval or approval of vendor invoices or any other internal control deficiency, right? So you will see if there are six key internal controls: segregation of duties, authorization, which basically is approval of invoices as well, at inadequate or review points, monitoring, right? So these are like six key internal controls that every entity should have. Now, internal control deficiency in your case study would be surrounded around that. There would be a weakness in that. For example, there's not sufficient approval going on, or there's lack of segregation of duties in that sort. So you should keep that in mind while you're reading the case study, because once you have understood the question, then it becomes easier for you when you're reading the case study to pinpoint what are the problems there. But if you don't understand the topic in itself, then of course you need to study and practice more questions on internal control, right? Another question, so step three would be to explain the impact of internal control deficiency, right? So once you have highlighted the internal control deficiency, that could be one question. The second question, or a follow-up question, which you will usually see in your professional exams, will ask you what would be the impact of that internal control deficiency, right? If there is some sort of a weakness going on in internal controls, then it's also going to impact on financial statements as well. We are mainly in business assurance, we are mainly concerned with financial statements, with the accuracy of financial statements, whether they are accurate or not, or free from material misstatements. If I am more specifically using the audit jargon, financial statements should be free of material misstatements, right? So if there are lack of internal controls, then it's less likely that the financial statement would be free of material misstatements. There's a possibility that there will be material misstatements, right? So once you have identified the internal control deficiency, or deficiencies, then a follow-up question, very well follow-up question could be to explain the impact of internal control deficiency, right? Right. So you will have to explain how it is affecting the financial statement, whether there's a risk of fraud, errors, misstatements in the financial statements, specific accounts, or things like that, right? So those would be the things. Once you have highlighted the impact, then another follow-up question could be to provide recommendations to address those internal control deficiencies, right, or deficiencies. So again, these are all actually questions in self as well. So the guide that you are seeing right now, that we are discussing right now, are also potential questions that you will see on the exam, right? To highlight internal control deficiency, then to identify the impact of internal control deficiency, and then recommend what would be internal control deficiency. There could be other internal control questions as well, like, for example, suggesting test of controls, right? So let's say, the company has a very good internal control system, but then you need, as an auditor, you need to actually get sufficient evidence by doing test of controls, right? So another question would be there that, suggest some test of internal controls or test of controls, as we say, for a certain internal control, right? So for example, how would you test, what would be your test of controls to test for segregation of duties? And then what would be the test of controls for approval mechanism or review mechanism or monitoring mechanism, right? Things like that. So let's get back to point number 4 here, to suggest some recommendations to address internal control deficiency after you have actually done the step 2 and step 3, which is to identify internal control deficiency, and once you have highlighted the impact as well, and then it would be easier for you to recommend that deficiency. So let's say there's lack of segregation of duty. The recommendation there is that the company should actually improve on their segregation of duties. They should actually segregate duties within their employees, right? So that would be one of the recommendations. Once you have done that, of course, conclusion is very necessary, where you actually sum up your entire answer, right? So you will summarize what would be the internal control, what were the internal control deficiencies, what would be impact, and what you suggested. So the conclusion has to reiterate the same information, not in detail, but in brief, but it has to reiterate the same information that you have presented or answered in your previous question. So that will be all from my side on a guide for how to answer your internal control questions on your professional accounting exams. Hope this video was helpful to you. Thank you very much for watching this until end. And if you think that this video was helpful to you, please feel free to suggest it to your friends, recommend it to friends. I have other videos as well on my channel. They might be helpful to them as well. And that's how accounting YouTube algorithm works as well. I would be very much appreciative if you could share my channel, subscribe to my channel, and see you around in other videos. Thank you very much for watching this video.